What if the Dark Ages never happened? What if the name itself is just a 700-year-old piece of bad branding? The story we're usually told is one of 1,000 years of grime, ignorance, and superstition, a long, boring wait between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance. But a pair of glasses from 13th century Italy, a mechanical clock from 14th century England, and a university charter from 11th century Bologna all tell a different story. They speak of a time not of darkness, but of a slow, powerful, and often brilliant dawn. The Italian poet Petrarch coined the term saculum obscurum, or dark age, back in the 1330s. He was a classicist. He was in love with ancient Rome and Greece. He saw his own time as a valley of shadow between those two great peaks of human achievement. And the name stuck. It was a perfect story for later thinkers in the Enlightenment who wanted to see themselves as champions of reason against an age of faith and dogma. It was simple, it was clean, and it was mostly wrong. The people of the Middle Ages didn't know they were in the middle of anything, they were just living. They were building cathedrals so complex, we still struggle to understand their engineering. They were creating legal systems that formed the bedrock of our own. They were wrestling with questions of science, faith, and the human mind in ways that are surprisingly modern. They were innovators, thinkers, and survivors. So why do we still picture them as mud-cake peasants who thought the world was flat? What have we forgotten? And what can their forgotten wisdom teach us about our own supposedly enlightened age? Number 17, what if your doctor prescribed a pilgrimage? We picture medieval medicine as a horror show. A dirty room, a screaming patient, a barber surgeon with a rusty saw. And yes, some of it was brutal. But that's not the whole story. The real forgotten wisdom here is the idea that health wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind and the soul too. It was holistic in a way we're only now starting to appreciate again. The foundation of their medicine was the theory of the four humors, inherited from the ancient Greeks Hippocrates and Galen. This proposed that the body was made of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was linked to an element and a quality. Blood was air and hot moist. Phlegm was water and cold moist. Yellow bile was fire and hot dry. Black bile was earth and cold dry. Sickness happened when these humors were out of balance. It sounds like nonsense to us, but it was a system. It was a rational framework for understanding the body. It meant illness wasn't just random divine punishment. It had a cause, and therefore it could have a treatment. A doctor in the 12th century wouldn't just look at your rash. They'd ask about your diet, your sleep, your mood, your environment. They practiced what they called the six non-naturals: air, food and drink, sleep and waking, motion and rest, excretion and retention, and the passions of the soul. They understood that where you lived, what you ate, and how you felt emotionally had a direct impact on your physical well-being. Today we call this social and environmental medicine. They just called it medicine. Hospitals existed, and they weren't just places to die. They were founded by religious orders as places of care or hospitality. St. Bartholomew's in London was founded in 1123. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris is even older. These institutions provided food, shelter, and nursing care. They separated patients with different ailments. They had gardens to grow medicinal herbs. The school of Salerno in southern Italy was a major center for medical learning from the 10th century. It brought together Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Jewish knowledge. One of its most famous figures was Trotula of Salerno, a female physician who wrote extensively on women's health in the 11th century in a text called The Diseases of Women. And what about that pilgrimage? A doctor might actually prescribe one, not just for divine intervention, but for the non-naturals. It forced a change of air. It involved physical exercise. It removed the patient from a stressful home environment. It provided a powerful psychological boost through faith and a sense of purpose. It was a prescription for the whole person. This connection between mind and body was deeply understood. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, writer, and composer, wrote medical texts that are stunningly holistic. She wrote about the connection between a sad heart and physical illness, essentially describing what we now call psychosomatic disease. Of course, their knowledge was limited, their anatomy was flawed because human dissection was rare. Their treatments could be harmful, but they weren't just fumbling in the dark. They were observing, systemizing, and treating the patient as a complete human being. They knew that a person's spirit was as important as their spleen. So what are the questions we still can't answer? If their holistic approach worked in some ways, how much of modern healing is due to the placebo effect of our own faith in science? We know stress causes physical illness, but do we really understand the biological mechanism any better than they understood the passions of the soul? And in an age of hyper-specialized medicine, have we lost the ability to see the patient as a whole person, not just a collection of symptoms? Number 16, could a medieval farmer out-innovate a modern startup? The image of the medieval peasant is one of endless, back-breaking toil for little reward. Stuck in the mud, living on gruel, at the mercy of the seasons and the local lord. While life was certainly hard, this picture misses one of the most important stories of the Middle Ages, a profound and lasting agricultural revolution. This wasn't about a single invention. It was a wave of interlocking innovations that changed the landscape of Europe, fueled a population boom, and laid the groundwork for the modern world. For centuries, farming in Europe had been a struggle. The light scratch plow, inherited from the Romans, was fine for the sandy soils of the Mediterranean, but useless in the heavy, wet clay soils of northern Europe. Around the 8th century, a new piece of technology began to spread the heavy-wheeled plow, or caruca. This was a beast. It had a vertical knife, a coulter to slice the sod, a horizontal blade, a plowshare to cut the soil underneath, and a moldboard to turn the earth over. It was so heavy, it needed a team of 8 oxen to pull it. This plow didn't just scratch the surface. It fundamentally transformed the land, creating the long furrowed fields we still see in parts of the European countryside today. It aerated the soil, improved drainage, and brought nutrients to the surface. But a big plow needs big power. Oxen were slow. The real game changer was the horse. Horses are faster and have more stamina than oxen, but the old Roman-style harness choked a horse if it pulled too hard. The solution, developed around the 9th century, was the horse collar. It rested on the horse's shoulders, allowing it to use its full strength without cutting off its wind. Combined with the invention of iron horseshoes for better traction and protection, the horse became the engine of medieval agriculture. A horse could plow twice as much land in a day as an ox. More land plowed meant more food was needed. This led to another brilliant innovation, the 3-field system of crop rotation. The old 2-field system was simple: farm one field, leave the other fallow to recover. You were only using half your land at any time. The 3-field system divided the land into 3 parts. One was planted in the autumn with wheat or rye. The second was planted in the spring with oats, barley, or legumes like peas and beans. The third was left fallow. The next year you rotated. This system had huge advantages. It meant 2/3 of the land was productive at any one time, a 33% increase in output. The spring planting of legumes was crucial. They restored nitrogen to the soil, improving fertility. They also provided a more varied and protein-rich diet for everyone. More oats meant more food for the horses, creating a virtuous cycle of more power, more land, and more food. This wasn't just a farmer's problem. This was a continental shift. The historian Lynn White Jr., in his 1962 book, Medieval Technology and Social Change, argued that these innovations were as socially disruptive as the Industrial Revolution. The heavy plow was expensive, so peasants had to pool their resources, fostering a more communal village structure. The surplus of food allowed the population of Europe to roughly double between 1000 and 1300. This growth supported the rise of towns, cities, trade, and specialization. Without this agricultural revolution, there would have been no Gothic cathedrals, no universities, no Renaissance. It all started in the mud. So are there things we still don't fully grasp? We know these innovations spread, but how? Was it wandering craftsmen, monastic orders, or just word of mouth? How did they manage the complex ecological balance of fields, forests, and pastures without centralized planning? And in a world facing soil degradation and a need for sustainable agriculture, is there something we can learn from a system that farmed the same land for 1,000 years without destroying it? Number 15, why did they build cathedrals to be solar observatories? The most persistent myth about the Middle Ages is that everyone believed the earth was flat. It's a great story. It pits the brave, enlightened Columbus against the ignorant, dogmatic churchmen. The only problem is, it's not true. No educated person in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat. They had known it was a sphere since the ancient Greeks. The Venerable Bede, an English monk writing in the 8th century, described the earth as a globe. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century philosopher, took it as a given. The idea of a Flat Earth Middle Ages was largely invented in the 19th century by writers like Washington Irving, who just made it up for his biography of Columbus. The real medieval view of the cosmos was far more sophisticated. It was based on the geocentric model of Ptolemy, with the Earth at the center and the Sun, Moon, and planets revolving around it in complex crystalline spheres. It was wrong, but it was a coherent scientific model based on the available evidence of observation. And they were incredible observers. The church, far from suppressing science, was often its primary patron. Monasteries were centers of learning that preserved ancient texts, including scientific ones. The new universities, which sprang up from the 11th century onwards, made the study of the natural world, or natural philosophy, a core part of the curriculum. Take Gerbert of Aurillac, a brilliant scholar who became Pope Sylvester II in 999, where he traveled to Islamic Spain to study mathematics and astronomy, bringing back Arabic numerals, a massive improvement over Roman ones, and the astrolabe, a complex instrument used to measure the position of celestial bodies. He was a scientist on the papal throne. A century later, thinkers like Roger Bacon, a Franciscan friar in the 1200s, were arguing for a new kind of science based on observation and experimentation. He worked on optics, astronomy, and even wrote down a formula for gunpowder. He was a forerunner of the scientific method. Perhaps the most stunning example of medieval science is hidden in plain sight, the great Gothic cathedrals. We see them as monuments to faith, but many were also giant solar observatories. According to research by historians like John Heilbronn, these cathedrals were precisely engineered to track the sun's path through the year. The architects would drill a small hole, an oculus high in a wall. At midday, a single beam of light would shine through, creating a spot of light on the cathedral floor. This spot of light would move day by day, tracing a long line on the floor called a meridian line. By marking the line, they could determine the solstices with incredible accuracy. This was essential for calculating the date of Easter, the most important festival in the Christian calendar. In cathedrals like Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence and St. Sulpice in Paris were in effect the most advanced scientific instruments of their day. This wasn't a conflict between science and faith. For them, they were two sides of the same coin. To study the creation was to better understand the Creator. The universe was a rational, ordered place governed by God's laws. The job of the natural philosopher was to figure out those laws. They weren't waiting for the Renaissance to discover science. They were laying its foundation stone by stone, formula by formula, but what don't we know? How exactly did master masons, who were often illiterate, transmit the complex geometric and engineering knowledge needed to build these cathedral observatories? We have few blueprints. What other scientific knowledge was embedded in medieval art and architecture that we haven't yet deciphered? And if the supposed conflict between science and religion is a modern invention, what does that say about our own assumptions about the nature of knowledge and belief? Number 14. How did a feudal king accidentally create your rights? We tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time of absolute power. Kings did what they wanted, and peasants had no rights. It was a world of top-down authority, where your life was dictated by the person above you in the feudal pyramid. But on a muddy field at Runnymede in England on June 15, 1215, a group of rebellious barons forced a reluctant King John to sign a document that turned that idea on its head. That document was the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, and it contains a piece of wisdom that is the cornerstone of modern freedom. No one, not even the king, is above the law. To be clear, the Magna Carta was not a democratic manifesto. It was a peace treaty written by and for the elite. The barons were angry at King John for his disastrous foreign wars, his high taxes, and his arbitrary abuse of power. Most of its 63 clauses deal with specific feudal grievances like inheritance rights and fishing weirs. But buried within the text were a few clauses that would echo through history. Clause 39 is the most famous. No free man shall be seized or imprisoned or stripped of his rights or possessions or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This was revolutionary. It established the principle of due process and trial by jury. Clause 40 was just as powerful. To no one will we sell. To no one deny or delay right or justice. This attacked the corruption of the royal courts. King John hated it. He tried to have it annulled by the Pope almost immediately. But the idea was out. The charter was reissued several times over the next century by other kings, and it became a potent symbol. It wasn't about granting new rights, but about confirming ancient liberties that the king had violated. It was a statement that the ruler was subject to the rule of law, just like everyone else. This idea didn't come from nowhere. It grew out of a rich medieval tradition of legal thought. Thinkers like Henry de Bracton in the 13th century wrote vast treatises on the laws and customs of England, arguing that the king was under God and the law. The concept of common law based on precedent and judicial decisions rather than royal decree was developing. At the same time, another crucial institution was emerging: Parliament. Kings had always consulted with their powerful nobles and churchmen. But over the 13th and 14th centuries, this great council began to evolve. Representatives from the towns and the shires of the commons were invited to attend. They were there mainly because the king needed to raise taxes, and it was easier to get consent than to face a rebellion. But in exchange for granting taxes, they began to present petitions and demand redress of grievances. They were slowly, painstakingly building the foundations of representative government. The medieval world was hierarchical and often brutal, but it was not a lawless wasteland. It was a society obsessed with rights, customs, and obligations. From the king down to the village peasant, everyone understood their place in a web of reciprocal duties. The wisdom of Magna Carta was to write down the most important one, that power must have limits. This principle was cited by English parliamentarians fighting King Charles I in the 17th century, and by the American colonists fighting King George III in the 18th century. It is written into the DNA of constitutions around the world. So, what are the unanswered questions? Given that most people were not free men in 1215, how did the principles of the Magna Carta eventually come to be seen as universal? What were the day-to-day legal struggles of ordinary peasants, and how did they navigate a system that was so often stacked against them? And in an era of mass surveillance and expanding state power, have we forgotten the fundamental medieval lesson that the law exists not to serve the ruler, but to constrain them? Number 13, what can a 12th century nun teach us about a healthy mind? Our modern world is obsessed with mental health. We have therapy, medication, and a complex vocabulary to describe our inner states: anxiety, depression, trauma. We see this as a very modern concern. The medieval world, we assume, was too busy with plague and famine to worry about feelings. But they were deeply concerned with the state of the mind, or what they would have called the soul. They just used a different language to talk about it. And their insights into the connection between mind, body, and spirit are surprisingly relevant. One of the key medieval concepts for what we might now call depression was acedia. It was first described by early Christian monks living as hermits in the Egyptian desert. They called it the noonday demon. Acedia was a complex state. It wasn't just sadness. It was a kind of spiritual listlessness, a profound apathy, a loss of purpose. It was a feeling that nothing mattered, that prayer was pointless, that life was a burden. The 6th century monk John Cassian described its symptoms in detail: restlessness, a dislike for one's cell, laziness, a tendency to gossip, and a deep sense of futility. It was seen as a serious spiritual danger because it could lead a person to abandon their vocation and their faith. This wasn't just a problem for monks. The concept of acedia and the related idea of melancholy linked to an excess of black bile became a way for medieval society to understand profound sadness and despair. And their treatments were holistic. The cure for acedia wasn't just to pray harder. It involved a change in routine, physical labor, conversations with a trusted spiritual advisor, and a focus on small, achievable tasks. There's a combination of what we would call behavioral therapy, talk therapy, and mindfulness. They recognized that the state of the soul was reflected in the habits of the body, and that changing one could help heal the other. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess, had a particularly sophisticated understanding of mental health. In her medical writings, she connected emotional states directly to physical ailments. She saw joy, or viriditas, greenness, or life force, as essential for health. Sadness, grief, and anger, she argued, could dry up this vital force and make the body vulnerable to disease. She prescribed music, good food, pleasant surroundings, and supportive friendships as part of her medical treatments. She understood that a person's emotional environment was as important as their physical one. For Hildegard, the mind didn't just affect the body, they were in inseparable unity. Of course, their understanding was framed in religious terms. Mental suffering was often seen as a spiritual struggle, a temptation from the devil, or a sign of sin. This could lead to harsh judgments and a lack of compassion, but it also meant that mental states were taken seriously. They weren't just random chemical imbalances, they had meaning. The struggle with despair was part of the human condition, a battle for the soul. This gave a kind of dignity and significance to mental suffering that is sometimes missing from our purely clinical models. So, what mysteries remain? How did ordinary people outside of monasteries and learned circles understand and cope with mental illness? We have the texts of the elite, but the inner lives of the peasantry are almost completely silent. When did the concept of acedia as a spiritual condition morph into our modern concept of depression as a medical one? And by treating the mind as a machine to be fixed with chemicals, have we lost the medieval wisdom that the health of the mind is inseparable from a sense of meaning and purpose? Number 12, why was a bag of pepper worth more than a human life? We think of globalization as a modern phenomenon, a world of container ships and the internet. The Middle Ages, in contrast, seem isolated and insular, a world of small, self-sufficient villages where no one ever traveled more than a few miles from home. This picture is profoundly wrong. The medieval world was a place of vast and intricate networks of trade and communication. It was a globalized world connected by roads of silk, sea lanes of spice, and rivers of ideas. A bag of pepper in a London market in 1300 told a story of a journey that crossed continents, cultures, and religions. The taste of medieval food for the wealthy was anything but bland. It was heavily spiced. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and cinnamon were not just flavorings, they were status symbols. A host who could serve heavily spiced food was showing off their wealth and connections. These spices all came from Asia, pepper from India, cloves and nutmeg from the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia. The journey was epic. The spices were carried by ship across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea, then by camel caravan across the desert to the Nile, then by boat to Alexandria. There, they were bought by Venetian and Genoese merchants who shipped them across the Mediterranean to Europe. At each stage, the price increased. By the time that pepper reached England, it was astronomically expensive, sometimes used to pay rent or taxes. It was a luxury commodity that connected a European lord to a farmer on the Malabar coast of India. It wasn't just spices. Silk from China traveled along the famous Silk Road, a network of caravan routes that snaked across Central Asia. Furs came from the forests of Russia, amber from the Baltic coast, European wool from England, and Flanders was traded for gold from Africa. This trade was facilitated by sophisticated financial innovations. Italian bankers in cities like Florence and Siena developed international banking networks. They invented the bill of exchange, a kind of early check that allowed a merchant to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another, avoiding the dangerous and cumbersome process of carrying chests of gold and silver. The Knights Templar, a powerful military order, ran one of the earliest and most trusted international banking systems. A pilgrim could deposit money at the London Temple and receive a letter of credit to withdraw it in Jerusalem. This exchange wasn't just about goods, it was about ideas, technologies, and cultures. The knowledge of the ancient Greeks, lost to much of Western Europe after the fall of Rome, was preserved and built upon in the Islamic world. In places like Toledo in Spain, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked together to translate great works of science, medicine, and philosophy from Arabic into Latin. This was the transmission belt that reintroduced Aristotle to the West, an event that would fundamentally reshape European thought. Paper, the compass, gunpowder, all of these were technologies that made their way from the East to the West during this period. The world was connected in other ways too. The Viking Age was not just about raiding, it was about the creation of a vast northern trade network that stretched from Newfoundland to Constantinople. Later, the Mongol Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, despite its brutal conquests, created a period of unprecedented peace and stability across Asia known as the Pax Mongolica. This made long-distance travel safer, and merchants like Marco Polo could travel from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan in China. The medieval world was not a closed box, it was a dynamic and interconnected system. But what are the big unknowns? We know the main trade routes, but how extensive were the smaller local networks that fed into them? How did illiterate merchants keep complex accounts and manage international partnerships? And given the constant flow of goods and ideas, why do we still insist on thinking of the medieval world as a collection of isolated cultures rather than a single interactive and globalized system? Number 11, could a woman run a kingdom, but not on her own land? The conventional story of medieval women is one of powerlessness. They were the property of their fathers, then their husbands. They were excluded from public life, denied education, and confined to the home. And for many women, much of this was true. It was a patriarchal society. But to leave it there is to ignore a huge and fascinating part of the story. Medieval women found countless ways to exercise power, influence, and agency, both within the structures of society and in defiance of them. In the world of the nobility, marriage was politics. A noblewoman was a strategic asset. Her marriage used to seal an alliance or secure territory. But this also placed her at the center of power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable figures of the 12th century, is a perfect example. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, one of the wealthiest territories in Europe. First, she was Queen of France, then Queen of England. She was a major patron of the arts, a crusader, and when her husband King Henry II and her son King Richard the Lionheart were away, she effectively ruled England. She was a political player of the highest order. There were others like Blanche of Castile, who ruled France as regent for her young son Louis IX in the 13th century and proved to be a brilliant and ruthless administrator. For women who wanted to escape the path of marriage and childbirth, the church offered an alternative. A convent could be a place of great power and intellectual freedom. An abbess was often a major landowner, managing vast estates and the lives of hundreds of people. She was a feudal lord in her own right. Hildegard of Bingen, again, is a prime example. She was not just a mystic and composer, she was a shrewd administrator who founded her own convent, went on preaching tours, and corresponded with popes and emperors, offering them often unsolicited and sharp political advice. But what about ordinary women? In the growing towns and cities, women were active in the economy. They worked alongside their husbands in workshops. Widows often took over their husband's business and could become members of guilds in their own right. There were guilds dominated by women, particularly in the textile industry like silk spinning and brewing. Women ran inns, worked as merchants, and dominated the retail trade for food and drink. Their economic contribution was essential. Even in the world of ideas, women made their voices heard. Christine de Pizan, writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries in France, was arguably Europe's first professional female writer. She supported herself and her family with her pen. Her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, is a passionate and learned defense of women against the rampant misogyny of the literature of her time. She built a symbolic city, populated with famous women from history and her own time, to create a space where women's virtues and accomplishments were celebrated. She was a proto-feminist, arguing for women's right to education and their essential role in society. Life was undoubtedly harder and more constrained for women than for men. The legal and social structures were built to favor men. But to see medieval women only as victims is to miss their resilience, their ingenuity, and their power. They were rulers, abbesses, business owners, artists, and writers who shaped their world in profound ways. But what are the gaps in our knowledge? The voices we have, like Eleanor's and Christine's, are overwhelmingly from the elite. What was the lived experience of a female peasant or a baker's wife? How did they understand their own lives and power? We know some women disguised themselves as men to travel or study, but how many were there, and what were their stories? And how did the powerful ideas of courtly love, which placed the lady on a pedestal, interact with the harsh legal and economic realities of women's lives? Number 10, how did they build a cathedral with a calculator made of string? Stand in front of a great Gothic cathedral like Chartres in France or Salisbury in England? Look up. You see towering stone vaults, delicate flying buttresses, and massive walls of stained glass, all reaching for the heavens. These structures were the skyscrapers of their age. They defy our stereotypes of the Middle Ages as a time of primitive technology. They are masterpieces of engineering, built with a sophisticated understanding of geometry, physics, and materials science. The forgotten wisdom here is that medieval builders were not just devout craftsmen, they were brilliant, innovative engineers. The key architectural breakthrough that made the Gothic style possible was the pointed arch. The traditional Romanesque style used rounded arches. A rounded arch directs the weight of the roof both downwards and outwards. This meant you needed massive, thick walls with few windows to support the structure. The pointed arch, borrowed from Islamic architecture, was a game changer. It directed the weight much more vertically, downwards into the supporting columns. This meant the walls no longer had to bear the main load. They could be made thinner and opened up for huge windows. This led to another innovation, the ribbed vault. Instead of a solid, heavy stone barrel vault, Gothic builders created a skeleton of stone ribs that crisscrossed the ceiling. The spaces between the ribs were then filled in with lighter stone webbing. This concentrated the weight onto the four corners of the bay, which was then channeled down the columns to the ground. It was a lighter, more efficient, and more flexible system, but the outward thrust didn't disappear completely. The tall vaults still pushed outwards. To counteract this, they invented the flying buttress. This was a freestanding stone arch that leaped from the top of the outer wall to a heavy pier or buttress standing away from the building. It acted like a stone finger, propping up the wall exactly where the pressure from the vaults was greatest. This elegant solution allowed the cathedrals to soar to unprecedented heights, creating interiors that felt weightless and were flooded with light. The walls became mere curtains of stone and glass. How did they do it? They didn't have computer-aided design or modern physics equations. They had geometry, passed down from the ancient Greeks via writers like Euclid. The master mason was the architect, engineer, and project manager all in one. His tools were simple: a compass, a straight edge, and a plumb line. They used a system of dynamic geometry, using ratios and proportions to lay out the entire building. The floor plan, the height of the vaults, the placement of the columns, it was all determined by a set of geometric rules. They also had an incredible hands-on understanding of their materials. They knew how stone would behave under compression, the limits of its strength, and how to cut it with precision. They also developed sophisticated construction machinery. They used giant treadwheel cranes, powered by men walking inside a large wooden wheel, to hoist huge blocks of stone and timber hundreds of feet into the air. They used complex wooden scaffolding and centering to support the arches and vaults as they were being built. This was a massive industrial enterprise. A major cathedral project could take a century or more to complete, employing thousands of craftsmen, quarrymen, stonecutters, masons, carpenters, glaziers, and blacksmiths. These were the largest construction projects in Europe since the Roman Empire. But what are the things we still don't understand? We have very few architectural plans or drawings from the period. How is this complex knowledge transmitted from one master mason to another across generations? Was it through secret societies like the later Freemasons, or through a more informal system of apprenticeship? And how did they solve unexpected engineering problems on the fly, hundreds of feet in the air, without the ability to do complex calculations? Were they simply over-engineering to be safe, or did they have an intuitive grasp of structural forces that we have lost? Number 9, were their cities more sustainable than ours? The medieval city often gets a bad rap. We imagine them as cramped, filthy, and disease-ridden. And in many ways they were. Streets were narrow, sanitation was a constant problem, and fire was a terrifyingly regular threat. But to focus only on the grime is to miss the subtle wisdom of their urban design. Medieval cities were in many ways remarkably sustainable and human-scaled communities. They were built for people, not for cars. A typical medieval city was a dense, walkable place. It was enclosed by a wall for defense, which limited its physical size. This created a compact urban form. Everything you needed for daily life, your home, your workshop, the market, the church, was within a short walk. There was no concept of a commute. Life and work were integrated. A craftsman lived above his shop. The streets were not just for movement, they were the primary public spaces. They were places for commerce, for socializing, for festivals, and for processions. The narrow, winding streets that we find so charming today were also practical. They provided shade in the summer and broke the wind in the winter. The city was organized into neighborhoods, often centered on a parish church or a guild hall. This created strong local communities. You knew your neighbors. There was a powerful sense of civic identity and mutual obligation. The guilds, which were associations of craftsmen or merchants, played a huge role in urban life. They regulated trade, set quality standards, and provided a social safety net for their members, caring for widows and orphans. They were a form of grassroots governance that ran parallel to the official city council. What about the environment? They were hardly ecological saints. Rivers were often used as open sewers, but they also had a much more direct relationship with the surrounding countryside than we do today. The city depended on the countryside for its food, fuel, and raw materials. And the countryside depended on the city as a market for its goods. Many city dwellers had their own gardens, growing fruits and vegetables. Pigs and chickens were a common sight in city streets. The waste from the city, including human waste or night soil, was often collected by farmers and used as fertilizer for the fields. It was a closed-loop system born of necessity. They were also masters of using local materials. Their buildings were made of timber, stone, and clay sourced from the immediate region. This gave each city and town a unique local character, a sense of place that is often lost in our modern world of standardized building materials. The historian Jean Gimple, in his book The Medieval Machine, argues that the Middle Ages was a period of intense industrial and technological innovation, particularly in its use of water and wind power. Water mills and windmills powered everything from grinding grain to fulling cloth and hammering iron. These cities ran on renewable energy. The medieval city was not a utopia. It was noisy, smelly, and often unhealthy. But it was also a vibrant, dynamic, and resilient community. It fostered strong social bonds, integrated living and working, and maintained a close cyclical relationship with its natural environment. It was built to a human scale. So, what are the lingering questions? We know about the formal governance of cities, but how did the informal social networks, the gossip, and the neighborhood ties actually manage urban life day to day? How did they cope with the constant influx of new migrants from the countryside without the kind of formal social services we have today? And as we try to design more walkable, sustainable, and community-focused cities, have we unknowingly been trying to recreate some of the best features of the medieval city we claim to have surpassed? Number 8. Why did they love to write about a king who never existed? If you ask someone in medieval Europe to name their greatest king, they might not say Charlemagne or Alfred the Great. They would very likely say King Arthur. Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, Camelot, the quest for the Holy Grail. This was the great story of the age. It was their Star Wars and their Lord of the Rings rolled into one. The strange thing is, King Arthur almost certainly never existed. So why was a society so obsessed with a fictional hero? The answer reveals a deep wisdom about the power of stories to shape values and ideals. The legend, as we know, it was largely kicked off by a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Around 1136, he wrote the History of the Kings of Britain. It was mostly fiction, but he presented it as real history. And his hero was Arthur, a great British king who fought off the Saxon invaders and conquered half of Europe. The book was a medieval bestseller. It was translated, adapted, and expanded upon by writers across Europe for the next 400 years. French poets like Chrétien de Troyes, writing in the late 12th century, added crucial elements. He introduced Lancelot and his adulterous love for Queen Guinevere. He introduced the quest for the Holy Grail. He shifted the focus from Arthur's military conquests to the adventures of his individual knights, like Gawain, Yvain, and Percival. These stories, known as chivalric romances, were the popular entertainment of the noble courts. They were recited by minstrels at great feasts. They explored complex themes of love, honor, betrayal, and faith. What was the point of all this? These stories were a kind of cultural code. They created a shared set of ideals for the warrior class, the knights. This was the code of chivalry. A true knight was supposed to be brave in battle, but also loyal to his lord, courteous to ladies, generous to the poor, and a defender of the church and the helpless. The Round Table itself was a powerful symbol. In a deeply hierarchical society, the table was round so that no knight could claim to sit at its head. It represented an ideal of fellowship and equality among the elite. Of course, the reality of knightly behavior was often very different. Many knights were little more than violent thugs, but the stories of Arthur provided a mirror, an ideal to strive for. They were a way of civilizing a violent warrior class, of channeling their aggression into more socially productive paths. The stories ask difficult questions. What happens when your loyalty to your lord conflicts with your love for a woman? What is the nature of true honor? How can a person live a virtuous life in a fallen world? These were not simple tales of good versus evil. They were morally complex and psychologically astute. The culmination of this tradition was Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, written in the 15th century while he was in prison. Malory gathered together the vast tangle of French and English, Arthurian stories, and wove them into a single epic narrative, from Arthur's birth to the final, tragic battle where the fellowship of the Round Table is destroyed by internal conflict and betrayal. It's a profoundly sad and beautiful book about the rise and fall of a noble ideal. It acknowledges that the dream of Camelot was ultimately impossible, but that the struggle to achieve it was what mattered. The wisdom here is the understanding that culture is shaped by its myths. We need stories that give us heroes to admire and ideals to aspire to, even if we know they are fictional. The Arthurian legends provided a moral compass for a whole society. They gave people a language to talk about their highest aspirations for justice, fellowship, and courage. So what are the big unknowns? We know how the stories were written down, but how did they spread among the illiterate majority? Were there popular oral versions of these tales that were different from the courtly poems we have? How did real knights and nobles actually think about these stories? Did they see them as pure entertainment, or did they genuinely try to model their behavior on Lancelot and Gawain? And in our own age, which is so cynical about heroes, what are the grand unifying stories that we tell ourselves about who we ought to be? Number 7, did they invent the university by accident? We think of the university as a timeless institution, a place of lecture halls, libraries, and robed professors. That image was born in the Middle Ages. The university is a purely medieval invention, and its creation was one of the most significant intellectual developments in Western history. It wasn't planned by a king or a pope. It just happened. It grew organically out of a new thirst for knowledge and a need to organize it. In the early Middle Ages, education was centered in monasteries and cathedral schools. These were primarily for training priests. The curriculum was limited, but starting in the 11th and 12th centuries, something changed. The agricultural revolution meant more food and a growing population. The rise of towns and trade created a need for educated administrators, lawyers, and doctors. And the rediscovery of ancient Greek texts, particularly the works of Aristotle coming through Spain, created a huge new body of knowledge to be studied. The students and masters began to gather in certain cities known for their schools, like Bologna for law, Salerno for medicine, and Paris for theology and philosophy. At first it was informal, like a famous teacher would attract a following of students who would pay him directly for lectures. But this created problems. Townsfolk would overcharge students for food and lodging. Teachers could be incompetent or just skip town with the students' money. The solution was to organize. The word university, universitas in Latin, originally just meant a corporation or a guild. In Bologna, the students formed a universitas to protect themselves. They organized collectively to bargain with the town for fair prices and to hire and fire their teachers. They could threaten to leave en masse, taking their business with them, a student strike. In Paris, the masters formed a universitas to regulate the quality of teaching, set curriculum, and award degrees. This was the model that would spread across Europe. Oxford and Cambridge were founded by masters and students who left Paris after disputes. What did they study? The core was the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium grammar, rhetoric, logic, and the quadrivium arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. After mastering the arts, a student could go on to one of the higher faculties, law, medicine, or the queen of the sciences, theology. The method of teaching was scholasticism. We often think of this as dry and nitpicky, but it was a rigorous system of logical inquiry. The master would pose a question, for example, does God exist? He would then present all the arguments against the proposition, citing authorities like the Bible, the Church Fathers, and Aristotle. Then he would present all the arguments for the proposition. Finally, he would offer his own solution, systematically refuting the counter-arguments. This method, exemplified by thinkers like Peter Abelard and Thomas Aquinas, trained students to think critically, to analyze arguments, to handle complex texts, and to defend their positions with logic. The goal was not just to memorize information, but to understand it and synthesize it into a coherent worldview. It was a system for dealing with intellectual disagreement. The medieval university was a rowdy and often violent place. Students were young, away from home, and prone to drinking, brawling, and rioting. But it was also a place of intense intellectual excitement. It was an international community. A student from England could study in Paris or Bologna, and lectures were all in Latin, the universal language of scholarship. It created a European-wide intellectual network that transcended political borders. This institution, born in the Middle Ages, is the direct ancestor of the modern research university. The very idea of a degree, a curriculum, a faculty, and academic freedom started here. What are the unanswered questions? How did a student from a poor background manage to afford a university education? We know some did, but the mechanisms of scholarships and support are not well understood. What was the student experience really like beyond the formal lectures and debates? And in an age where the value of a liberal arts education is constantly questioned, what can we learn from a system that placed the ability to think logically and argue clearly at the very center of all higher learning? Number 6, what does a forest have to do with freedom? Our image of the medieval landscape is often one of two extremes: the dense, dark, and dangerous wildwood of fairy tales, or a completely deforested wasteland stripped bare by peasants desperate for firewood. The reality was something in between, and far more complex. The medieval relationship with the forest was one of careful and often contentious management. And in England, the forest became a surprising symbol of the rights of the common person against the power of the king. Forests were essential to medieval life. They provided the two most important resources, wood and food. The wood was the primary fuel for heating and cooking. It was the essential building material for houses, ships, and tools. Forests also provided food. They were a place to graze pigs, which fattened on acorns and beech nuts. They provided honey from wild bees, nuts, berries, and medicinal herbs. And crucially, they were a source of meat through hunting. Because they were so valuable, forests were rarely just left to grow wild. They were managed landscapes. One of the key techniques was coppicing. A tree like hazel or ash would be cut down to the stump. The stump would then send up multiple new fast-growing shoots. These shoots could be harvested every 7 to 15 years to provide a sustainable supply of wood for everything from fence posts to firewood. It was a form of renewable energy. Large timber for building was grown in a system called wood pasture, where standard trees were grown far apart with livestock grazing in between. But forests were also the playground of the powerful. In England, after the Norman conquest of 1066, the Norman kings declared huge swathes of the country to be royal forest. A forest, in this legal sense, wasn't necessarily a dense woodland. It could include villages, farms, and open heath. What it meant was that the area was subject to a separate, harsh set of laws, the forest law. The purpose of this law was to protect the venison and the deer and the greenery they fed on for the king's personal hunting pleasure. Under forest law, ordinary people were forbidden to hunt deer. They couldn't clear new land for farming. They couldn't even build a fence or carry a bow and arrow. If their dog was found in the forest, it had to be lawed, meaning some of its claws were removed so it couldn't chase deer. The punishments for breaking these laws were brutal, including fines, imprisonment, and mutilation. This was a major source of resentment for centuries. The legendary outlaw Robin Hood, stealing from the rich and poaching the king's deer in Sherwood Forest, was a powerful symbol of this resistance. This brings us back to Magna Carta. 2 years after the Great Charter of 1215, a companion document was issued, the Charter of the Forest. It was reissued in 1225 and became just as important. The Charter of the Forest rolled back the boundaries of the royal forest to what they had been in the 12th century, returning huge areas to the common law. It abolished the death penalty for taking the king's deer. And, most importantly, it affirmed the traditional rights of commoners in the forest. It gave free men the right to ageisment, graze their pigs, and pannage, collect nuts, and mast. It confirmed their right to take wood for their own use. This was a landmark victory. It was a formal recognition that the natural resources of the land did not belong exclusively to the ruler, but that common people had ancient and legitimate rights to them as well. It was a piece of environmental justice. It enshrined the idea that the health of the community depended on its access to the commons, the shared resources of the landscape. So what are the lingering puzzles? We know the law, but how was it enforced on the ground? How much illegal poaching and clearing really went on? How did communities manage their common resources to prevent a tragedy of the commons where everyone overexploits them? And in a world where access to clean air, water, and green space are becoming critical issues, what can we learn from a 13th century charter that saw access to the natural world as a fundamental right? Number 5, how did people tell time before the clock? In our world, time is a tyrant. It's measured in nanoseconds. We have deadlines, schedules, and appointments that rule our lives. The clock is always ticking. Before the late Middle Ages, this entire way of thinking about time didn't exist. Time was natural, cyclical, and flexible. The forgotten wisdom here is not that they were timeless, but that they lived by a different kind of time, one tied to the rhythms of the sun, the seasons, and the human body. For most people, the primary clock was the sun. The day was divided not into equal hours, but into the temporal hours. There were 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, regardless of the season. This meant that a daylight hour in summer was much longer than a daylight hour in winter. It was a fluid organic system. The main markers of the day were sunrise, midday, and sunset. People told the time by the position of the sun in the sky or the length of the shadows. The other great timekeeper was the church. The monastic life was structured around the horarium, a daily cycle of 8 prayer services, from matins in the middle of the night to compline after sunset. The times for these services were announced by the ringing of the monastery bells. For the people living in the villages and towns around the monastery or church, these bells were the soundtrack of their day. The bells told them when to start work, when to take a midday meal, and when to stop for the day. It was a public, communal, and approximate time. No one was 5 minutes late. You were just late for the bell. The year was also cyclical, governed by the agricultural seasons and the liturgical calendar of the church. The year began not on January 1st, but often on March 25th, the Feast of the Annunciation. The major holidays, Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the numerous saints' days structured the year. These were not just religious observances, they were public holidays, times for feasting, fairs, and rest from work. The pace of life ebbed and flowed with the seasons. Winter was a time of rest and repair. Spring was for planting, summer for growing, and autumn for the intense labor of the harvest. Time was not a straight line moving ever forward, but a great wheel that turned with the year. Then, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a radical new technology appeared: the mechanical clock. These were not small, personal clocks. They were huge, iron machines driven by weights that were installed in the clock towers of cathedrals and town halls. They didn't even have faces. At first, their job was to ring a bell to mark the hours. And these were new hours equal, abstract hours, 24 hours in a day, each one exactly the same length, regardless of the season. This was one of the most profound shifts in human consciousness. The historian Lewis Mumford called the clock, not the steam engine, the key machine of the modern industrial age. It disconnected time from human events and natural rhythms. It created an independent world of mathematically measurable sequences. This new clock time was essential for the rise of capitalism and science. It allowed for the synchronization of labor, the charging of interest by the hour, and the measurement of experiments. The transition was slow. For centuries, the old natural time and the new mechanical time coexisted. But the clock was relentless. It slowly imposed its abstract grid on the world. We gained precision, but we may have lost something too: a more human and flexible relationship with time. So, what are the questions we still have? How did the invention of the mechanical clock actually happen? The first makers are anonymous, and the technological leap is still something of a mystery. How did ordinary people react to this new artificial time? Did they resist it or embrace it? And in our 24/7 hyper-scheduled world, are we beginning to see the psychological cost of living by the clock's abstract tick-tock rather than the rhythms of our own bodies and the natural world? Number 4, what did they do for fun? The medieval world seems so serious, all that praying, plowing, and fighting. It's easy to imagine their lives as a grim, colorless slog, but medieval people knew how to have fun. In fact, their lives were punctuated by a surprising amount of leisure time, festivals, and games. They understood the importance of play, feasting, and community celebration as essential parts of a healthy life. The Christian calendar gave them a lot of holidays. Besides every Sunday, there were dozens of saints' days and holy days throughout the year. Estimates suggest that in some parts of Europe, as much as a third of the year could have been holidays of one kind or another. These were not just days for church. They were days for feasting, drinking, and entertainment. Villages would hold ales, which were big parties to raise money for the parish. There were weddings, baptisms, and funerals, all of which were major communal events. The biggest party of the year was Carnival, the period leading up to Lent. This was a time of the world turned upside down. Social norms were suspended. A peasant could be elected Lord of Misrule or boy bishop and preside over the festivities. There were parades, masks, gluttonous eating and drinking, and bawdy plays. It was a sanctioned release valve for the pressures of a hierarchical society. It was a time to mock the powerful and celebrate the flesh before the 40 days of fasting and penitence of Lent. They played games, lots of them. They had board games like chess, which arrived from the Islamic world, backgammon, known as tables, and a game called Nine Men's Morris, whose boards are still found carved into the stone seats of cathedrals. They played dice games, which were a constant source of trouble and a favorite target for moralizing preachers. They played sports, a rough, chaotic version of football, where entire villages would compete to move an inflated pig's bladder to a goal, was popular and incredibly violent. They had wrestling, archery contests, and games that were precursors to modern hockey and cricket. The nobles had their own, more elaborate forms of fun. The tournament was the ultimate medieval sport. At first, it was a giant, chaotic mock battle called a melee. Two teams of knights would charge at each other over a wide area of countryside with the goal of capturing opponents for ransom. It was dangerous and often deadly. Over time, it became more ritualized and focused on the jousts, where two knights would charge at each other with lances. It was still dangerous, but it was also a spectacular piece of theater, with elaborate armor, heraldry, and ladies watching from the stands. There was also storytelling, music, and dance. Minstrels and troubadours traveled from court to court, singing epic poems and love songs. In the village, people told folk tales and sang ballads. They had mummers' plays where actors in costume would perform traditional stories, often at Christmas. Dancing was hugely popular at all levels of society, from the stately court dances to the wild, energetic circle dances of the peasantry. This wasn't just mindless fun, it was deeply woven into the fabric of social life. Festivals and games strengthened community bonds. They affirmed shared values. They provided an outlet for creativity and competition. They were a way of making life in a hard and often unpredictable world more joyful and more bearable. So what don't we know? While we know the names of some games, the specific rules are often lost to us. How exactly did they play medieval football? What were the tunes to all those peasant songs and dances? And how did the official culture of the church, which often condemned frivolous and drunken festivities, coexist with the deep-rooted popular love for a good party? Was it a constant battle, or did they reach a kind of unspoken compromise? Number 3, why was it better to be a monk than a king? This question sounds absurd. A king had power, wealth, and freedom. A monk lived a life of poverty, chastity, and obedience, shut away from the world. But for a certain kind of medieval mind, the monastery offered something far more valuable than a crown of chance to create a perfect society in miniature and to do meaningful, lasting work. The monastery was not an escape from the world, it was an attempt to rebuild it from the ground up. The monastic movement, started by figures like Saint Benedict in the 6th century, was based on a simple but radical idea. In a chaotic and violent world, a community could be formed that was dedicated to ora et labora, prayer and work. The rule of Saint Benedict, the blueprint for Western monasticism, laid out a detailed plan for a balanced life of communal prayer, private reading, and manual labor. It was a masterpiece of social organization. Monasteries became the powerhouses of medieval Europe. They were often founded in remote, uncultivated areas. The monks, through their own organized labor, would clear forests, drain swamps, and turn wilderness into productive farmland. They were pioneers in agricultural technology, using water mills, improving crop strains, and developing techniques for winemaking and cheesemaking. Cistercian monks, in particular, were brilliant agriculturalists and sheep farmers, and their monasteries became centers of the European wool trade. They were self-sufficient economic engines. They were also the intellectual centers of the age. Before the rise of universities, the monastery library was the main repository of knowledge. Scribes in the scriptorium painstakingly copied and preserved the texts of the Bible, the Church Fathers, and, crucially, the pagan classical authors of Rome and Greece. Without the monastic scribes, much of the literary and scientific heritage of the ancient world would have been lost forever. They weren't just copiers. They created stunningly beautiful, illuminated manuscripts, works of art that combined text with intricate decoration and illustration. A monastery was a well-ordered and stable society in a world that was often anything but. A king could be assassinated or lose his kingdom in a battle. His dynasty could die out. A monastery as a corporation could outlive any individual. It offered a kind of permanence and continuity. For an abbot, the head of a major monastery, his position could be more secure, and in some ways more powerful than that of a local lord. He controlled vast lands, commanded great wealth, and held immense cultural and spiritual authority. The monastic life also offered a different kind of freedom. While it was a life of obedience to the rule, it was also a liberation from the brutal social pressures of the outside world. You were freed from the need to marry, to fight in wars, to scramble for status and wealth. It was a life dedicated to a higher purpose, whether that was the salvation of one's own soul, the service of the community, or the pursuit of knowledge and art. For many, this was a profoundly attractive alternative to the secular world. So while the king might have had more worldly power, the abbot had a different kind. He was the head of a community that was trying to live out an ideal. It was a community that was preserving the past, building the future, and creating islands of order, learning, and productivity in a turbulent world. But what are the great unknowns? What was the real day-to-day emotional life of a monk like? We have the rules and the chronicles, but the personal struggles with doubt, loneliness, or ambition are rarely recorded. How did these all-male communities interact with the wider world, particularly with women? And what was the process by which these idealistic communities often became wealthy, bureaucratic, and sometimes corrupt corporations, a cycle of reform and decay that repeated itself throughout the Middle Ages? Number 2, did they have an industrial revolution? The term industrial revolution belongs to the 18th and 19th centuries. It's a story of steam engines, factories, coal, and iron. It's the story of the birth of the modern world, but what if it wasn't the first? Some historians, most notably the French scholar Jean Gimpel, have argued that the High Middle Ages, from roughly the 11th to the 13th centuries, experienced its own powerful industrial revolution. It was a revolution based not on coal, but on the power of water and wind. The Romans knew about water mills, but they used them sparingly. They had a large slave population, so they had little incentive to develop labor-saving technology. The medieval world did. After the collapse of the Roman Empire and the decline of slavery, Europe had a labor shortage. They had to find new ways to get work done. Their solution was to harness the power of nature on an unprecedented scale. The key technology was the water mill. They took the basic Roman design and improved it, developing new gearing systems that could translate the vertical motion of the water wheel into the horizontal motion needed for grinding. The Doomsday Book, a massive survey of England completed in 1086, records over 5,600 water mills. That's 1 mill for every 50 households. This was an astonishing level of mechanization for a pre-industrial society. By the 13th century, that number was likely double, and they used these mills for everything. The primary use was grinding grain into flour, a backbreaking task that had traditionally been done by hand by women. Mechanizing this process freed up millions of hours of human labor, but they didn't stop there. Using a new invention, the camshaft shaft with projecting lobes, they could convert the rotary motion of the water wheel into a reciprocating up and down or back and forth motion. This opened up a huge range of industrial applications. Water power was used to power trip hammers in forges for making iron tools and weapons. It was used to pulp rags for making paper, a new and cheaper alternative to parchment. In the textile industry, water mills powered fulling mills, where large wooden hammers beat and cleaned woolen cloth, a process that was previously done by workers stamping on the cloth in vats of water and urine. They powered bellows for blast furnaces and saws for cutting timber. The Cistercian monks, in particular, were brilliant hydraulic engineers, building complex systems of canals and leats to power their monasteries' industrial complexes. Where there wasn't a reliable source of running water, they used the wind. The windmill, which seems to have appeared in Europe in the late 12th century, was another revolutionary power source. This wasn't just a few scattered inventions, it was a systematic application of mechanical power to production. It led to a significant increase in productivity, especially in key industries like iron and textiles. It changed the landscape, with rivers and streams being re-engineered to power mills. It created new kinds of skilled workers, the millwright, the engineer, the machinist. This was a society that was actively seeking out new technologies to increase its power over the environment and improve its standard of living. It was a dynamic, innovative, and machine-building culture. So, are there things we still don't fully understand? Who were the anonymous engineers and craftsmen who designed and built these machines? Their names are almost all lost to history. How was this technological knowledge shared and spread across Europe with no engineering schools or textbooks? And if this medieval industrial revolution was so powerful, why did it seem to run out of steam in the 14th century? Was it the devastation of the Black Death, a change in the climate, or did this early form of industrialization reach some kind of natural limit? Number 1, were the Dark Ages just a lie we told ourselves? We began with the question, what if the Dark Ages never happened? After looking at their medicine, their technology, their laws, their art, and their ideas, the answer seems clear. The term itself is the problem. It's a caricature, it's a label slapped on 1,000 years of history by later ages that wanted to feel superior. It's a story that is simple, comforting, and profoundly misleading. The wisdom we have forgotten is not a single secret or a lost formula. It is the simple fact that the people of the Middle Ages were as complex, as intelligent, as innovative, and as human as we are. They lived in a different world, with a different set of beliefs and a different set of tools. But they faced the same fundamental human problems: how to create a just society, how to understand the world around them, how to find meaning in their lives, and how to cope with suffering and death. But they were not in the dark. They were building on the heritage of Rome and combining it with new ideas from the Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic cultures of Europe, as well as with the brilliant scientific and philosophical traditions of the Islamic world. It was an age of synthesis and innovation. They invented the university, the mechanical clock, eyeglasses, and the heavy plow. They developed legal systems based on the rule of law and the concept of rights. They built structures of such beauty and engineering genius that they still take our breath away. They created a body of literature that explores the deepest questions of the human heart. Why, then, has the myth of the Arc Ages been so persistent? Perhaps it's because it's a useful lie. For the Renaissance humanists, it created a narrative of rebirth with themselves as the heroes. For the Protestant reformers, it was a way to paint the Catholic Middle Ages as a time of corruption and superstition. For the Enlightenment thinkers, it was a perfect foil for their own age of reason. And for us, today, it serves as a convenient historical basement, a dark and primitive time that we can use to measure our own progress and congratulate ourselves on how far we've come. But this story costs us. It cuts us off from a huge and fascinating part of our own history. It flattens a millennium of dynamic change into a single static image of mud and misery, and it blinds us to the genuine wisdom that can be found in the medieval world. Their holistic approach to health, their sustainable agriculture, their human-scaled cities, their understanding of the power of community, of shared stories, and of a life balance between work, prayer, and play. The real Middle Ages were not dark. They were a time of long, slow, difficult, and brilliant creation. They were the crucible in which the modern world was forged. To dismiss them as a dark age is not just a historical error. It is an act of arrogance. It is a failure to recognize that wisdom can be found in the most unexpected of times and places. So the final questions are not about them, but about us. Why are we so attached to the myth of the Dark Ages, even when the evidence overwhelmingly contradicts it? What does our need to believe in a dark past say about our anxiety concerning our own future? And if we finally let go of this comforting lie, what other forgotten truths about our history and ourselves might we be ready to discover?